Welcome to episode 3 of our podcast series, A More or Less Perfect Union, what matters most to Americans as elections approach. Hi, I'm Jim Gabe of Citizen Arts. In episode 1, we journeyed back to 2016 before an election that rocketed Trumpist populism and seemed to be a clarion call for magnified political, social, and cultural turmoil. At that time, we interviewed nearly 200 Americans from all walks of life around the U.S. Those interviews became the essence of our educational documentary titled A More or Less Perfect Union. This film has been presented in forums at universities, high schools, libraries, and before civic and culture groups throughout the U.S. and in Europe, China, and India. Do you remember what mattered most to you before the turmoil magnified? If you haven't listened to episode 1, you may want to do so as a prelude to the rest of our podcast series. Why? Because it'll give you an intriguing, we think unique insight to America's attitudes, priorities, hopes, and dreams 6 years ago. Because it'll give you a fascinating, maybe in some ways unsettling comparison with the contemporary discussions in episodes 2 and 3. And this might give you ideas about what voting could mean over the coming years, or even simply that we'd better vote. And now, dear friends, we're honored to present the second half of our nationwide discussion among 23 Americans. Just about all of them appeared in our 2016 documentary. It's a reunion of sorts, expressions of the American soul as our democracy calls us to the ballot box. At the conclusion of our discussion, I'll offer a few final thoughts. Welcome back, discussion participants. I am so fortunate to be continuing this conversation with you. In episode 2, we discussed many issues that are front and center in American life as elections approach. Now we're going to extend our focus to the U.S. and its place in the world. Let's get right into it. Our first discussion topic. The U.S. government has made the confrontation between representative democracy and autocratic rule a central theme of its foreign policy. But some autocratic rulers, Putin and Xi foremost among them, have questioned whether the U.S. really is a democracy. What do you think?
Chris, in North Carolina, we are absolutely a democracy. It's showing cracks, though, and that's probably much to the delight of Putin and Xi. They've been on a mission to discredit self-determination, self-government in favor of their authoritarian vision of the world. But if America isn't going to stand for democracy, who else can make that stand? There are plenty of wonderful democracies across the world, but we are the standard bearer for that form of government.
Beth from Austin. I don't really care what Putin thinks of our democracy. I mean, it is a democracy, technically a representative republic. Regardless of what Donald Trump says, we do have fair elections, a peaceful transfer of power. Those are the facts.
I'm from Boston. It has its problems. There's no question about it. But it's a functioning democracy. Criticism of our form of government coming from tyrants, really, is something I just don't pay attention to.
Karen, Illinois, yes, we are a democracy. One thing I think really separates us from other types of government and other societies is that we have freedom of speech. We wouldn't be having this podcast and feel like we were able to really discuss our thoughts without that. And I think it's a very special part of the United States that we have to remember.
Phyllis of Florida. Yes, I think we're a democracy. I think we're less powerful than we used to be. I think there's a undercurrent of rage that just is coming out, and with all the shootings everywhere, it's in a lot of ways becoming more like the Old West. We just need to get it back under control.
Daryl from Chicago. I certainly think that the U.S. is a democracy. It's an imperfect democracy, but I think it's as good as you're going to get in the world today.
Robert, in Texas, we are absolutely a representative democracy. The frustration is, unfortunately, many Americans do not engage, which allows money and other significant interests to drown out the voices of the majority. But it doesn't mean that our democracy doesn't work. It just means it's a democracy and it's messy.
Tisha in California, we are a democracy. It's a bit of a shit show right now, but it's the best we're going to get. And before I cede this country to people who don't see women as equals, don't understand the racism problem, I'll die on this hill. I'll stay and fight. I'm not moving to Canada.
Dwight from Florida. Yes, I believe we're still a democracy. I believe money has too much weight and control. I'm not sure it always hasn't, but we need to constantly fight that. But I'm thankful every day for a free press, because I think that saved us from losing our democracy in the last election.
This is Jacob in Louisiana. I don't see things as, as a democracy or an autocracy or plutocracy, whatever you might describe it. And they're all bleeding in together. It's more of a label than anything else nowadays.
Javier from Boston. There is a growing acceptance of different forms of authoritarian leadership. Because what we see is not the traditional dictatorships that get to power through a coup d'etat, but we see these authoritarian regimes that actually get introduced through the democratic system. And then they start undermining that very system and transforming it to the point that is no longer a democratic rule. That is beginning to happen in the United States.
Frank, Virginia, was talking about this very question yesterday in class. I understand Russia and China and anybody else's perspective when they question our democracy, because if you look at what a democracy is supposed to be versus what we show the world, they don't match. When it comes to control and power and an opportunity to be a part of the process, we're far closer to an oligarchy than we are a democracy.
Hang Liu, Massachusetts. We Americans take pride in freedom, the government of the people, by the people, for the people. But time has changed. USA government is built upon money. The city is like this, school is like this, private business ownership is like this. I also would say wars have Iraqi operation to topple down the government and to protect democracy. And everyone knew because they have oil, and maybe security is secondary to oil. People with money getting richer, people with limited or selling labors are getting poorer. If we don't change this, I have to predict the private ownership, money-based economy will not last.
Yeah, Joe Holt in New York. We are basically a moneyed oligarchy, and when you look at just practical examples, the gerrymandering that renders the popular opinion almost moot, and because of the money and the politics, the individual is getting farther and farther away from being able to affect the discourse or the vote.
Alfred, Hawaii. I think they tried. I think they tried to be a democracy, but I think we've been overtaken by moneyed interests, and we don't represent people anymore. We represent money. They want to kind of paint it as people because companies are considered people now. So yeah, it's fake. If nothing changes, then we're just going to have the locals that were here from the beginning exiled to Las Vegas. And
hold on a second, Alfred. Las Vegas? What's that all about?
That's just a common place for natives like here to move to after they can't afford here anymore. People call Las Vegas like Hawaii too, because it's that common. And so if it keeps continuing, we're just going to have billionaires like taking over the island, and this should be their little paradise.
Jacob in Louisiana. It's on the squeaky wheel, it's the grease. I don't think it should be that way. I think the country is more in a reactive mode instead of proactive. identify the problems, we try to address them before it gets out of hand. That should be the goal, and that is not happening currently.
Alfred, Hawaii. So I think that we're a plutocracy. The people who have the most money have the biggest voice. That's what we've been seeing the last 50 years, at least. Our government, everyone's now questioning, who are they serving? Because it's clearly not the people. Even on bipartisan topics, it seems like the rich always get what they want. The outcome doesn't look good for the 99% of us. I feel like a lot more people are kind of conscious of it, right? Like that's why we're seeing more protests and unionizing.
Dee in Indianapolis. It's hard to feel like we live in a democracy when so many of the decisions by our government are different from what the majority has said they wanted. 2/3 of America wanted Roe to stand, and the Supreme Court overturned it. The majority of people want more gun regulations. Our two-party system doesn't even really acknowledge ideas that are good for the country, because if the other side suggested it, I'm automatically going to reject it because I cannot be seen to be collaborating with the enemy. America's individualism has not helped us in some ways.
This is Adolfo from Louisiana. We are not perfect. We have never realized ever in our history the ideals that we put down on paper. However, I think there are enough of us, and that includes people in office, who strive to reach them. And that's the difference. The title of this is perfect, a more or less perfect union. And we're probably less perfect, but we reach, and that matters. And that's the difference between us and China and Russia and other autocratic places. We've never accepted that reality. We keep reaching for the aspirational goals in our Constitution.
Aspirational goals. America is certainly built on them. But are such goals still relevant? It's been suggested that the U.S. is in decline as a global superpower, that it's seen its best days. Those are certainly applause lines for our erstwhile friends, Putin and Xi, but they're also crowd pleasers for some in the U.S. Think MAGA. Is this valid? If so, where is the U.S. faltering?
Adolfo from Louisiana. Allow me to offer this perspective. Let's say we are no longer the number one global superpower. So what? I don't love America because we're number one. I don't love America because we're the strongest. I don't love my dad because he could beat up other dads, right? I love this place for what it provides for me and for my family and the opportunities therein, and because I was fortunate enough to be born here.
Daryl from Chicago. We are preoccupied with non-serious issues, and we're losing the focus on what has made us great historically. American drive, American ingenuity. We've become a little bit fat and lazy. We lack the drive, the ingenuity, the will to build and produce.
John from Boston. If America is falling, somebody please tell me who's catching up to us. Maybe it's China. Maybe somebody can make an argument for Russia. Daryl talks about obsession with silly issues, but you know what? That's the difference between America and some of these other countries, that we can waste time talking about irrelevancies because we have that freedom of speech. But when you get right down to specifics, we are not doing as good a job educating our children as we did 40 years ago.
Robert from Texas. We are without question the strongest economic, military, innovative country in the world. We are still necessary from a moral perspective and economic perspective, needed, requested, and required to be an active participant on the world stage. We are able to create value. We are paying on an order of magnitude more in health aid, social aid, the NGOs around the world than any other country. We have created so much good. I'd just like to see us bring a lot more of that in our disadvantaged communities here in our own country.
Tisha in California. The struggle that we're all having is directly related to a real lack of education. If we can get educated on issues of science, climate change, I mean, all of it's in one big burrito, and then civics. The ignorance that society has with regards to civics really started in my generation, in Gen X.
Rabina, Connecticut. We used to be considered pretty much the best educational system in the world. There are so many cracks in the system, everything from not representing our history the way that we should, to cutting out entire swaths of history, to not being able to come to a compromise on how children are taught, to the cost of education. Why can't we figure this out with all of the resources that we have?
Education, education, education. So many of you brought it up in the first half of our discussion, and the theme continues here. Okay, let's take a look at some headline topics related to the U.S. and the world. What comes to mind when I say NATO?
Alfred, Hawaii. I don't see what NATO is there for. We're literally experiencing genocide as Black people in the United States. Where's NATO? We're like being killed by police officers and no justice is being served. If NATO is not taking care of me, they don't exist as far as I'm concerned.
Jacob in Louisiana. I have to agree with Alfred. I don't feel like NATO is a part of my daily life. There's a war in Ukraine. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to get everybody together. They don't fix the roads in New Orleans. They don't get my father out of a FEMA trailer and put him into a solid house. So I think NATO is it's just another political arm that the United States uses and other allies use to influence economic restrictions and maybe people moving from one country to another, immigration, that sort of thing.
Liu, Massachusetts. NATO was created at the end of World War II for the sake of security to avoid war in Europe. The counterpart to the Warsaw Pact, and that was part of the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. So in my opinion, NATO should have ended its historical role. It didn't. In itself, NATO created a lot of problems.
Dee Dee from Indianapolis. NATO makes me think of that slogan, membership has its privileges. And if you're not a member, it doesn't matter what's happening to you. Like what's happening in Ukraine, they're not a member. And so it really is another exclusionary organization that doesn't necessarily perform the greater good.
Susan, California. The Russian invasion of Ukraine provided an excellent example of how America can be a real force for good. It was American diplomacy behind the scenes that got all of the NATO countries on the same page as far as how they were going to respond. They were looking to America to lead them in the early days of the invasion.
Joe Holt, New York. I think the power of NATO is dependent upon our belief in being part of a larger world. We're getting away from seeing ourselves as part of a collective global body. And I think that is a particularly short-sighted view that doesn't have a true understanding of the sort of global interconnectivity that could help elevate all of us.
Chris from North Carolina. NATO still, to me, represents security and stability for the free world. It's certainly demonstrated its value in the face of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. I think as over time, it should evolve to the point where other countries like Germany and France and the UK assert more leadership and involvement.
Javier from Boston. NATO has been the vehicle for a larger political, social, and cultural role of the U.S. at the global scale. Therefore, it continues to be important. An interesting consequence of war in Ukraine has been this unification of the different countries under NATO. And this is a new opportunity for the U.S. to regain or redefine its leadership.
Speaking of Ukraine, I bet some of you were, like me, not so long ago, digging up info on places like Lviv, Kharkiv, Mariupol. what should be the role of the United States vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Liu, Massachusetts. My position is to encourage Russia-Ukraine to negotiate an agreement to end the war. The sooner, the better. We really should focus on USA and try to solve the problems, improve the livelihood of people, encourage non-military resolutions of problems and conflicts, and try to be a peacemaker instead of a war promoter for selfish interests.
Robert in Texas, what's the alternative to not staying with and supporting Ukraine, particularly given the fact that 2 world wars have started in roughly that general area? It should cause us great pause to see those Scandinavian countries have immediately asked for entrance to NATO.
Adolfo from Louisiana. No one wants World War III. No one wants to jump in and just start lobbing bombs places. But by the same token, we can't allow other countries to just do whatever it is they want to do, particularly to allies, because we are so connected economically with people in that part of the world. So no, I think Robert stated that beautifully. Who are we going to be if not the good guys in that situation?
Tisha, in California, this administration is doing what I would hope we would do, which is provide aid, financial, weapons, medical, pressuring our other allies to send money. I stopped just before we put troops on the ground. I think that we just got out of one war halfway across the world. I think that it is a mistake to immediately get into another.
This is Jacob in Louisiana. We should be more involved. I understand the hesitant nature to not get into a war with Russia. Absolutely. I mean, I could see the struggle that the Ukrainian people are going through. And with all the resources that the United States has, not to mention our allies, to not be doing more, it's ludicrous. It's terrible.
Dee Dee from Indianapolis. I'm very concerned about Ukraine. And I know as a country we struggle with, are we going to be the world's police people? We can't police every other nation, but man, this just really feels bad. And I agree with Jacob, needs more intervention.
Karen, Illinois, I don't begin to know or to want to guess about what would happen if things got really out of control in that area of the world. I don't think Russia would stop their invasion just with Ukraine. But the whole idea of war and the types of weapons we have nowadays is very scary. And because I don't have a lot of trust in leaders, I don't know, maybe somebody would be crazy enough to detonate a nuclear weapon. I don't know.
Danny in California. I think it is important for the U.S. to help Ukraine in the war. The attack from Russia, that's one of the dominoes. We're fighting here for our democracy. But to let Putin have a victory, that would be detrimental to us.
Susan, California. Putin clearly wants to regain some of what he saw as the glory of the Soviet Union, where Russia had this whole constellation of other countries that were grouped around it, kind of like England had the British Empire. But at the same time, he's not stupid. And the schoolyard bully is going to go as far as somebody will let him go, but kind of no farther.
Let's see if we can develop this a little more. President Zelensky repeatedly says Ukraine is fighting for more than its sovereignty, that its battles for Western values of the rule of law, democracy, respect for life and liberty. Does that make sense to you?
Joe Holt, New York. Zelensky is smart and charismatic and understands the world stage. He's a showman. He knows he's making a movie of the little country that could. So while I support in general, we also have to be very careful about getting involved in some sort of decade of a boondoggle. But right now, Putin is the big dog. And anything we can do to weaken his grip, because he is a clear autocrat who has zero interest in the elevation of his people. Anything we can do right now, we have to do.
Daryl from Chicago. I'm not sure what our goal is in supporting Ukraine. If it's because we want to be disruptive to Russia, I mean, that might be a legitimate goal. If it's truly we're helping a democracy, that's a legitimate basis for it. But what are the implications of doing that? Are more people going to die in the Ukraine because of the prolonged war? Maybe what we're doing in the Ukraine is a deterrent in Taiwan and other aggression that China may engage in. But maybe it'll encourage them in the sense of everyone's occupied in the Ukraine.
Joe Jones from New York. I think it's the issue of oil, land, and power. So we really have no business in their business. And I think it's a very dangerous situation for us with Russia's plans. I think that we shouldn't meddle.
Rabina, Connecticut. I feel as if us being involved in Ukraine is also a humanitarian responsibility, simply to go and protect a group of people that haven't done anything.
Joe Holt, New York. I would love to believe, and it might be true, what Rabina is saying, right? It might be, let's go help out this group that's being, massacred and slaughtered. That's certainly the sell in it. But history has kind of told me that our involvement there is definitely political, very much economical, ideological.
Alfred, Hawaii. I know from the Black community, it's like you can expect to be called the N-word there, like from the people that live there. How do you help people that like innately hate you, right? Like it's like, yeah, not everyone is like racist over there, but I feel like it's enough of a problem. Black people that are like using their energy, their time, their resources to help you in your time of need, and you want to degrade them. That's where I'm like, look, okay, as a country, yeah, maybe, but like as a Black person, probably not. Like I have enough to deal with.
John from Boston. I found it refreshing. Americans stood behind and rooted for Ukraine and helped Ukraine fight a tyrant. That was an uplifting of the spirit of America.
Dwight from Florida. We have to meet Putin's challenge because he has, as we've seen with strong men in the past, if you surrender Ukraine, then that only whets his appetite for the next conquest.
Javier from Boston. I would totally agree that the question of Ukraine is not about Ukraine only, it's about the eastern border of Europe. Because certainly if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, it would continue to expand to regain that old Russian empire that seems to be in the horizon of Putin in a kind of almost absurd but terrifying historical anachronism.
Beth from Austin. Americans generally love a David versus Goliath story. And I think that's part of the reason why Americans rallied around Ukraine so quickly. There's a lot of people complaining about the money we're sending to help Ukraine when we have issues here in the U.S. But what they're experiencing over there is very real. And if the money we are sending Ukraine is too much for some to stomach, what will we end up spending in the long run without shutting Putin down now?
What do you think should be the goal in the U.S. relationship with Russia? Is this something that should contain Putin?
John from Boston. I think that it's very difficult to formulate today what our overall goal with Russia should be. I think right now, Putin is getting to make the first move. And that may be unfortunate, but I think the reality is we don't know what to do with Russia unless Russia starts doing something first.
Daryl from Chicago. That Europe became so dependent on Russian gas was a problem. And it's something that they're now realizing, and that's unfortunate because I don't think that Putin is anyone's friend in Europe.
Beth from Austin. I would like to stress how important energy independence is to America in terms of national security. If we're having to rely on Russia or Saudi for oil, it makes us very vulnerable to their whims. And That's dangerous position to be in. And I think for all of the faults of Donald Trump, I think one thing he did well was encourage America to be energy independent.
Joe Jones, New York. I believe we should make friends. The rest of the world doesn't look at us in such a glorified way anymore. I have fear that Russia and China could be an issue if we don't start playing nice. This is a dangerous game we're playing. We can't even get things right here.
Joe Holt, New York. I don't know that there's going to be anything that's going to make us cut off relationships with Putin, because a lot of that relationship is financial.
There's strong sentiment among you that regaining some harmony with Russia is important. But Putin as well? The autocrat labeled a murderer, terrorist, instigator of an invasion of a free, peaceful, sovereign nation, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths and untold suffering, not just of Ukrainians, but Russians too. How does the U.S. do business with him? Let bygones be bygones?
Tisha, in California, there's no question that Putin has committed very serious war crimes in this invasion. When this is over, he needs to be held responsible and prosecuted for all of it.
This is Adolfo from Louisiana. If I believe that I can learn and change my behavior, then I have to believe that Putin can learn and change his behavior as well. So while I personally don't believe it's likely, I have to believe it's possible.
Susan, California. I understand Joe Biden's extreme frustration with Putin and blurting out the guy has got to go, but we somehow managed to have a relationship with Joseph Stalin, who was busy killing millions of his own people because we realized he was a world actor. Sometimes diplomacy is kind of like sausage. You don't want to see how it's made, but somehow you have to continue the conversation.
Yeah, Robert's in Texas. We don't have a choice. If we stick to our values, which some in this country and other countries have questioned whether we've been involved excessively in meddling in other countries' internal affairs, as well as picking and choosing who their rulers get to be. But the reality is, Susan is exactly correct. We don't have a choice. We have to have a relationship with whomever is in power in Russia. They are a nuclear power.
Javier from Boston. Putin represents this threat to democracy at a global scale. And the United States, with the support of NATO and other allies, have to be able to denounce that position, to denounce that imperialism, and to take a position of economic pressure or sanctions as it is happening, or at certain points it might translate into military action as it is happening in Ukraine.
Daryl from Chicago. I think Russia is more of a threat to Europe, but I think Russia is less of a threat to us than China.
Ah, yes, the People's Republic of China. It makes sense. A quarter of the world's population, an economy that will likely pass the U.S. in a few decades, at least in terms of gross domestic product, a massive military. China and the U.S., the two most powerful nations in history by far, an increasingly tense relationship. What comes to mind first when you think of China?
Brian, in Virginia, I'm always struck by how quickly China was able to build from within to become the China of today. In America's lack of knowledge regarding China.
Alfred, Hawaii. China's doing a much better job of bringing people out of poverty. They're spreading the wealth better. Even in their businesses, like they can prototype all sorts of technology way faster than we can. It took us 200 years to get here, and it took them 50. Yeah, it's an incredible achievement. I mean, there's problems with it for sure, but good on them. They're good to learn from.
Han Liu, Massachusetts. By heritage, I'm Chinese. I came here, I was 26 years old. I want to correct one thing about Albert saying, China did not take 50 years to get where it is. China had started when European industry took place. There's a big, well-grounded basis, foundations in terms of light industry, heavy industry, defense, and so on. Lastly, I want to say there are still a lot of problems, big gap between the rich and poor in China. China is struggling. USA is struggling.
Jacob in Louisiana. I think China is scary. I was scheduled to go there to meet potential business partners. I literally was intimidated to the point where I didn't go because I heard a story about someone from America going there, maybe saying the wrong thing, acting the wrong way. Not that I would do that, but that person is still in jail in China.
Chris from North Carolina, China is an essential partner economically to the United States and the rest of the West. We have to acknowledge that. We are heavily dependent on the resources, labor, and products that they produce. We have to be thoughtful and strategic on how we engage with them.
Daryl from Chicago. When I think of China, I think of its economic might. It's outproducing us, and we become reliant on its cheap goods and have a higher standard of living as a result of that. But at the same time, our dependence on China could be our downfall. I'm not worried about armed conflict with China. I'm worried about losing an economic war. And one of the things that this country has to figure out is how to promote production of goods in the United States that China is currently producing that are central to our economy and do it in an efficient way, because we're not going to do it cheaper than China's doing it. The government's got to figure that out. It's like oil independence.
Beth from Austin. Daryl is absolutely right. It's encouraging to see so much energy put into recruiting semiconductor facilities to the United States. And while the press touts how great that is for jobs, it really has a much bigger impact in terms of us being able to manufacture everything from a cell phone to cars or airplanes. There's a lot of that going on nationwide, and I hope it will continue, because if not, China will be able to do whatever they want, and we're just going to have to go along with it.
John from Boston, I agree. I don't see China as so much a military as an economic threat. We absolutely have to reduce our dependence on China. Just look at the COVID crisis with supply chain and other issues because of that dependence. If China is going to surpass us, that's how they're going to do it economically. It won't be militarily.
I've jotted down a few of the terms you've used to describe this relationship between the U.S. and China. Threats, dependency, intimidation, ignorance. Can the U.S. and China find common ground, a win-win competition? Or are the cultural and political and other differences just too big to overcome?
John from Boston, I think we've got to get beyond those differences and try to have a friendly relationship. Richard Nixon, for all his faults, had a policy towards China. And I think we have to follow his lead on that. We are far better off if we're talking to each other in a reasoned way than we are if we're at a standoff on different types of issues.
Dwight from Florida. We need to strengthen our relationship with the Chinese, as well as protect certain strategic industries. I separate China and Russia. Russia's a declining power.
Brian in Virginia, the deck is stacked, so to speak, and China is dealing off the bottom a lot. We aren't in a position to compete with them, so the relationship isn't a 50-50 at all. It's not a partnership at all.
Beth from Austin, I do think that we try to play well with China, and I don't know that they're interested to play well with us. And so it's a two-way street. I think they tend to take advantage of nations who only use diplomacy. They're a bully. And so you've got to stand up to them sometimes. I think the perfect example is how we're reacting to Taiwan. We depend on China for a lot. And I understand you don't want to upset that gorilla, But I think that's just an example of how we try to play nice and it's not reciprocated.
Danny in California. I've gone through Amazon because I'm addicted, and I cannot find items that I want that are not made in China. I think that the everyday American doesn't realize how much we depend on China. And if they did know, that might color their opinions.
Tisha in California. When it comes to China and the United States, I don't think that either has a clear policy or strategy when dealing with the other nation. I do feel like the role of two superpowers is to coexist peacefully. We can have our opinions on their human rights abuses. They can have their opinions on our education system or our journalists or whatever. There are a lot of misconceptions. We are a lot more alike when you really look at the inner workings of each society.
Joe Holt, New York, you're going to have to deal with this world power. It behooves us to not be in a bad relationship. If we want to take on the human rights abuses, we have to examine our own hypocrisy and wanting to pay $4.99 for a T-shirt. That doesn't come from a healthy situation. We're either going to have to be honest with ourselves, which has been historically hard for us to do, or risk upsetting a nation that is in many ways more powerful than we are right now.
Susan, California, our relationship with China is so terribly caught up with all of the economic ties we have, all of the pieces of products that are manufactured in China. And we saw how complicated it was when COVID hit and supply lines got cut down, and all of a sudden we were all aware that there were things like supply chains. The feeling was after World War II that if you could connect countries economically, they would be less likely to go to war. We would like to think that's true. And I think we conduct our foreign policy somewhat along those lines.
Robert in Texas, picking up where Susan left off, it is recognizing that an autocratic communist country of 1 billion people is utilizing state resources to compete as well as stealing our technology. The reality is, to use a phrase from Ronald Reagan, trust but verified. We have to work with them, but we also have to be much tougher. We thought that if we allowed our industry to move there, that globalization would ultimately lead to economic prosperity, which would make their people demand that they play nicely on the world stage. That's clearly not happening. So I think the reality is we hold them absolutely accountable, and we don't put all of our eggs in one basket. We start reinventing industry, manufacturing, et cetera, here, and realizing that globalization has its limits, particularly if we want to manufacture the things that are critical for ourselves. And we want to make sure that we can have more people have the kinds of jobs necessary to be able to have our American dream.
This is Adolfo from Louisiana. Piggybacking on what Robert said, isolationism is not viable. But human rights, I don't think, can be negotiable. And to the degree that we have allowed China to violate human rights so I can have cheap stuff is unacceptable to me as an American. And I think the only way that we get out of that cycle is to do what Robert said. We're going to have to find a way to put those sorts of jobs that we've allowed to go to come back, because the alternative is we allow awful things to happen to other people in the name of cheap goods. And that has to be the guiding principle of our relationship with China or any country.
Susan, California. One of the things that has always bedeviled our relationship with China is that we assume on a cultural level that the Chinese want to be like us. They will decide they want a democratic government. Well, the 5,000-year-old culture is a very different mindset from ours. And I think we just plain are naive and arrogant to think that the Chinese want to, quote, grow up to be just like us.
This is Jacob in Louisiana. I don't think we know enough about China. I know I don't.
Dee Dee from Indianapolis. I'm kind of like Jacob. I feel like I know of China, but I don't know about China. I know what I hear in various narratives. I don't know.
Han Liu, Massachusetts. USA has more wealth, more established institutes, but sometimes the laws are too rigid. China have a more traditional people-based, family-based values, considerations to motivate people to get work or job done. When we get to know each other, we'll say, wow, we really can benefit from each other and becoming smarter to solve problems.
Some of you know Citizen Arts has done a lot of work in China. In fact, we're now putting together a podcast series. It'll be an in-depth look at the U.S.-China relationship. And it's from that framework, I say it's really very interesting listening to your views on China. They show such nuance and realism. Often that's not what we hear from either U.S. politicians or the Chinese government. It's become increasingly dark, negative, xenophobic. How come?
John from Boston. I think that type of rhetoric is built into election cycles. That's unfortunate, but it's going to continue to happen. But we should be able to get beyond that when the election is over. I think the world will be a better place if we can do that. It's not unpatriotic to want to talk to China.
Rubina, Connecticut. I think they're playing to what we discussed earlier, which is the other. It's low-hanging fruit for politicians, right? You can just say, blame it on China. It's because of China that we're in this position. Your kids aren't getting into college because there's kids from China who are coming in and taking their place.
Brian from Virginia, I agree with what Rubina has said 100%. The other thing that's striking is the same way those politicians don't ever want to go back and look at how America built its wealth and how China has built its wealth, right? It's better not to talk about those things. It's better just to receive the product and keep it moving so that I can get my kayak sent from Amazon in 2 days versus 7. We've got our bad guy thousands of miles away. So it plays right into, we're not the problem.
You know, certainly since World War II, depending on whom you're talking to, the U.S. has been considered the goodest or baddest player on the world stage. Looking ahead, where could the U.S. find continuing leadership that might have some chance of healing the fault lines in our very small planet?
Robert's in Texas. We should absolutely be a leader in every area that contributes to emotional, psychological, spiritual, and physical health. That means healthcare. That means education. That means environmental. It means contributing the absolute maximum to make this a world that optimizes everybody's ability to live free, to live their optimal life.
Karen, Illinois, we have to take a stronger stance with the problems of climate change.
Daryl from Chicago, we need to be a leader in space. It could be very, very important in terms of communication systems, military systems, economic growth. There's potential there, and we should be emphasizing that through government action, also private investment. That's where we can be a leader, and that can benefit the world.
Beth from Austin. Something that we have done well is investing in other countries, those who have far fewer resources than we have. We're very fortunate. We have a lot of things going for us. And I think it's our moral obligation to help others across the world do well also.
Rubina, Connecticut, humanitarian innovation. You see catastrophic events all over the world. There are organizations from the United States that are unbelievably fast about mobilizing and feeding people or giving them shelter. There's a lot of people out there who are doing good. And that is something that I hold on to when I think about all the other ways in which we're striving and failing.
Javier from Boston. The strength of the United States, unlike some other economic powers, has not been its manufacturing compared to them. It is the capacity to innovate, reimagine all the different aspects of our society, not only our technologies.
Either Chris from North Carolina, Javier nailed it. I think about the openness of the American markets, the creativity, the ingenuity. That is something profound that we can build upon. And that's something we have in large measure, whereas China has not developed those things to nearly the same degree. Leveraging that as a strength in other parts of the world, we could play a part in lifting people up to become economic contributors in the global community.
Brian, in Virginia, we brought the world this ability to change realities and do it quickly. What's next? The world does look to us for innovation.
Susan, California, we have the technology to do amazing things. And if we applied technology to some of the problems that are bedeviling not only us, but the rest of the world, my gosh, the world would be a better place.
Joe Holt, New York, the thing that is impressive about our country at our best is our attempt and success at combining all of these various races, ethnicities, points of view from different parts of the world. The promise of America is still intact. There's still people that are willing to risk their lives to get here because the existence here is better than the existence there.
Joe Jones, New York. If America invests into its greatest commodity, which is the people, the diversity, I think we get to that place where we're able to establish ourselves, as a moral giant.
Tisha in California. In world affairs, we will continue to be a superpower. But instead of being the world police, we are more like the class president of the world, right? We lead by example. Leading by example starts with our Supreme Court being apolitical. Our elected officials governing for the people who elected them.
Dwight from Florida, we just need to take the high road in all matters. I know it's not always possible, but I think we need to continue to strive for, as you say, a more perfect union.
Danny in California. What might benefit the world is we get ourselves back to a nation that is by the people, for the people. Then hope is what we can offer the world.
Dwight, Danny, you've just cited the U.S. Constitution and Abraham Lincoln. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a most fitting segue to the final act in our forum. I'm going to set the scene. You are President of the United States. You've been invited to the United Nations. You are being called to the podium. What is the centerpiece of your message to the world?
Education. That's where it all starts. Not only education within boundaries, but also education to understand other countries, become better people, better friends, better family. Let's educate ourselves. Who's doing it right? Let's learn from our compadres.
The only way to move forward is with mutual respect, cooperation, and agreement on the things that we value, like education, healthcare, equality.
Get back to representation of the people, emphasize education, science, and having a respectful space for all.
We in the United States are hereby making a pledge that we will share our life-saving technologies for the betterment of countries all over the world.
The only way to sustain life on this planet is through cooperation, universally. What we've done to this planet has to be remedied if the future is going to thrive and be able to live a life that doesn't involve just survival.
Find new ways to collaborate to mitigate against the effects of climate change.
Broaden our horizons on the climate challenge.
I encourage countries to develop nuclear power, to develop and exploit their natural resources, to develop and use alternative energy sources to help their people prosper.
We live in one village on this blue, watery planet. We have many joy, happiness, but we need to come to an agreement. Stop wars, any wars, big or small.
The plea for peace. Come together and talk. It's all about peace.
We all need a moral compass. And if we have a moral compass and we follow it, then peace will prevail.
Together, we will develop pathways towards equality and mutual sacrifice and success.
Everyone is so sure they're on the side of righteousness, but we can't all be right. It's better that we operate with humility, kindness, and strength. Being strong isn't about squashing the other person. Being strong is about being able to coexist and cooperate with people that disagree with you.
That golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Apply that to the negotiations on all the different issues that need to be resolved.
We are stronger and better together. The divided house cannot stand. And make no mistake, we are one house.
A commitment to equal rights for all people. No bias based on gender, heritage, sexual orientation, ability.
Thinking about what every individual needs and make that the minimum so everyone's taken care of, has a house, food on their table, right? From there, like, the sky's the limit. Be a billionaire, but don't ignore these people that need help.
A message for the world, celebrating openness and appreciation of freedom.
We will now, from this point forth, eliminate the terms black and white. If we would just address each other as human beings, we create a new foundation, one that encompasses all people equally.
My fellow citizens of the world, we face threats we've never faced before in terms of climate change, in terms of division. But if we put the common good before self-interest, we will be able to overcome and create a world that is safe and hospitable for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and beyond.
I'm going to keep it simple. More love, less hate. That's all I got.
Leadership values to admire. Thank you so much, all of you. You've been spectacular. I'm left thinking about your voices, how valued they'd be if they were front and center in our daily lives. I believe your decency, thoughtfulness, compassion, your tolerance, respect are the truest voice of America. And it's a privilege for us at Citizen Arts to present them in a more or less perfect union. Thank you. We hope to see you all again very soon. And now, for our listener friends, a few final thoughts. We began each of the 3 episodes in this podcast with the same question. Have the thinking and attitudes of Americans evolved in a meaningful way since the 2016 election? I believe our nationwide discussions have given us answers. I'm going to start with a boiling topic that was not at the forefront of discourse a few years ago: abortion, or more largely, women's rights and body autonomy. The knowledge, perspective, and passion brought to this subject by our nationwide panel seems to support notions that the abortion-related vote in Kansas could be a harbinger for what's to come. We'll soon know. What was at the forefront of discussion a few years ago and continues to be front and center, but with even greater passion and fervor, are the lack of quality education for all, inequality in economic opportunity or economic justice, and the ever-elusive goals of peace on earth and freedom for all. 6 years ago, our education discussion was lit up by the dismaying realization that the U.S. had fallen well behind many other developed nations. But the current education discussion is now more centered on specific, in some cases seemingly intractable issues. Chief among them, racial inequity and discrimination, assimilating and harmonizing the extraordinary growing diversity of America, and ideological religious influences on what should or should not be brought into our classrooms. Critical race theory, book censorship, and so on. 6 years ago, there were sobering questions about the widening gap in economic opportunity and the imperative to find ways for all people to benefit from America's growth and wealth. But now the commentary has veered into questioning the very structure of America's economic and financial systems and whether they inevitably benefit the rich while providing diminishing opportunities for the rest. This is captured in terms repeated by a number of our panelists, that the U.S. is now an oligarchy, a plutocracy. In the language of protest, the 1% versus the 99%. And world peace and freedom. A few years ago, perhaps beaten down by decades of flawed, futile, costly, brutal military conflicts abroad, Americans were questioning whether the USA should be a force for global synergy, rapport, and democracy. Whether that shining beacon on a hill that took its glow from a mighty sense of American exceptionalism was dimming out. Whether isolationism, America First dogma, was now more plausible for the USA. But over the past 6 years, 4 challenging events have overshadowed, or at the very least, rocked this kind of thinking. One, of course, is COVID, the first truly global plague of our times. It brought home the reality that the U.S. cannot realistically isolate itself, that for myriad health, economic, and cultural reasons, the U.S. needs to be worldly in its goals and smarter and more proactive in pursuing them. How else do Americans identify, protect against, and treat diseases that spring up and spread in a flash anywhere? And if a plague strikes, how does the U.S. protect supply chains and economic well-being except by thoughtful, cooperative, cross-border action? The poet John Donne put it this way: "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind." Second challenge: the rise of autocratic populist movements worldwide, including in the USA. Seemingly out of nowhere, the sanctity of the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. democratic way of life are being questioned. And the conversation has become bizarre. For example, there are voices proposing the U.S. adopt the governing style of an autocratic, self-proclaimed Christian nationalist who runs Hungary. No knock on that historic, cultural rich gem of a nation, but really, Hungary is about the size of Indiana, with a GDP that matches Oregon and a population just shy of Michigan. For sure, size matters when you're talking about national governing and interacting with the world. Third, the invasion of Ukraine, a manifestation of the horrors that can be unleashed by one man with dictatorial power, psychopathic traits, and delusional visions of empire building. Horrors that can impact the world, and we'd thought the possibility of such a thing had ended with Hitler. And fourth, the furiously intensifying, increasingly unfriendly competition between the U.S. and China, the 2 most powerful nations ever. The potential for global calamity is reaching unprecedented levels. This is so anguishing. Humanity could benefit so much from these 2 countries working together. Considering these 4 challenges, our panelists were nearly universal in affirming the U.S. must be a force for peace and harmony in the world. And they offered many ideas for what kind of leader the U.S. should be. For some, it has to start at home by coming to grips with the festering evils of racism and poverty, and with other social and economic dilemmas. And in doing so, setting an example for how a diverse, democratic society can equitably enhance the lives of all its citizens. Others put the focus on marshaling and sharing America's can-do, innovative talents to help the world tackle make or break matters related to energy, climate, education, health, humanitarian needs, and more. And there were calls for America to up its direct investment in the vast, untapped, often poverty-besieged human capital in developing nations, so the, in quotes, have-nots can pull themselves up into the ranks of the, in quotes, haves. A final thought. Yes, friends, our discussion about many specific matters of great importance has remained the same and has also changed dramatically since the 2016 election. But it's not in the specifics where the most profound alteration in our thinking is seen. At least, I don't think so. 6 years ago, there was a theme throughout our documentary expressed by people all over the U.S. Simply put, it spoke of an America that believed it could turn its noble ideals into realities for all its citizens. But now, a few tumultuous years later, there's a change in tone, most apparent in discussions about race relations, individual freedoms, economic inequity, gun violence, political and class divisions. Now there's a questioning, even an anxiety, about whether America's civic, economic, and judicial institutions, its cultural values and practices, can meet the challenges. Yes, there's fatigue, skepticism, even cynicism, some of it likely magnified by COVID. But our panelists, they would rally toward optimism. We know this because we asked what would be their top priorities if elected to public office, if given the opportunity to speak on behalf of the USA to the world. All of those priorities were aimed at bettering what Americans represent as citizens and as a society. In doing so, they point the way for their fellow citizens as elections approach. Identify and champion political leaders who value America's constitutional ideals, who will inspire the people to stand up, shake the tree, find the best in themselves, their country. They are out there for sure. That's part of the enduring strength of America. Exceptional people step up to lead America's noble striving for a more perfect union. On behalf of my Citizen Arts colleagues and the extraordinary participants in a more or less perfect union, a heartfelt thanks for lending an ear. We invite you to join the conversation. Let us know what you think. Please stay healthy in mind and body, wealthy in goodwill, and wise in action. This has been a Citizen Arts podcast presentation. All rights reserved.